Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. My job is to take complicated things and make them simple, not simpler, which implies a loss of accuracy, but simple, which is different. I work for a pharmaceutical company translating research documentation into language that regulators and non-specialists can read and act on. I take a sentence that requires 3 postgraduate degrees to pass, and I find the cleaner sentence living inside it. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I'm good at it in the way that people are good at things they were probably always going to end up doing. The skill feeling less like something acquired and more like something located. I'm telling you this because the way I process things matters to what happened. I am a person who works with information for a living. When something difficult arrives, I tend to move toward it rather than away from it, because most difficult things, in my experience, become less difficult once you find the right language for them. I have believed this for most of my adult life. I believe it less confidently now, not because I found something that language couldn't handle, but because I found something that language handled perfectly, and the handling turned out to be the thing I should have been careful about. My mother died in September, quickly, which was a mercy, and at home, which was what she wanted. She was 68, and she had been a bioinformatics researcher for most of her professional life, and she was the kind of person who made the people around her feel that precision was a form of kindness, because she was precise about the things that mattered and loose about the things that didn't, and she always knew the difference. I miss her in the specific way that you miss someone who was good at being a person. The world has fewer of those than it should. 3 weeks after the funeral, I drove back to her house to begin clearing out her home office. My sister handled the practical estate things. I took the books and the papers because I was the one who would know what to do with them, and because I wanted the task. Sorting through someone's working life is a way of knowing them that living alongside them doesn't always give you. Her journals were on the shelf between her reference books, labeled by year in her handwriting. 12 of them, covering 1997 through the year before she died. I packed them in a box with some of her reference texts and drove home with the box in my back seat and told myself I'd read them gradually, a year at a time, the way she would have appreciated. I read the early ones quickly. They were what I expected: technical observations, methodological notes, the intellectual diary of someone doing careful work and thinking carefully about it. Interesting to read if you had the vocabulary for them, which I mostly did. I felt close to her reading them, that precise mind on every page. I reached the 1999 journal on a Wednesday evening, and I was halfway through it before I understood that something had changed in her writing. The entries were longer, more personal. She was working through something that wasn't a methodological question, and she was doing it in the language she used when a problem didn't have existing language yet, which I recognized immediately because it was the same register I used for the same reason, and I had apparently gotten it from her. She was circling something, every few entries coming at it from a different angle, something she had found and flagged and been told to set aside and could not set aside because it sat in her the way certain things sit in certain people, which is to say, it would not leave. I made coffee, and I sat back down, and I read. The Human Genome Project ran through the 1990s and concluded its primary mapping in 2003. My mother was not one of the names anyone remembers from it. She was peripheral, connected to quality control analysis work, the kind of careful secondary labor that primary research requires and rarely credits. She did this work for several years alongside two colleagues, a man named Dr. Aldrich and a woman named Dr. Priss, and the three of them ran analysis on genomic samples for longer than most people in the project stayed in their specific roles. In 1999, during a routine quality control pass, they found a sequence. My mother describes it carefully in the journal. Present in every sample they tested, 100% prevalence, which is unusual enough on its own to be remarkable. No identified biological function. It didn't code for a protein anyone could identify. It didn't appear to serve a regulatory role. It just sat in the genome the way an unfamiliar word sits in a text you're reading, in your second language, present and legible, and not yet translated. What bothered my mother, and she is specific about this, was the structure of it. Random genetic drift over evolutionary time produces irregularity. The genome is full of sequences that accumulated through chance and necessity and the long imprecision of biological history. This sequence was not irregular. It had a consistency and an orderliness that, in her words, does not have the texture of accident. She wrote this, and then she wrote it again 2 pages later, as if she was still arguing with herself about whether she was allowed to say it. She flagged it through the appropriate channels. She was told to document it and set it aside. The project was enormous, and the timeline was under pressure, and a sequence with no identified function was a secondary question in an environment of primary ones. She was told it would be addressed in the secondary analysis phase. It was not addressed in the secondary analysis phase. She kept her own notes about it for 20 years. Aldrich and Priss had their own genome sequenced during the project's internal quality control process, standard practice for researchers working with genomic samples. Both of them confirmed what my mother's analysis had shown. The sequence was in them. It was in all of us. She was certain of this. It was in every human genome she had ever looked at, which meant it was in every human genome, which meant there had never been a person alive who didn't carry it. And then both of them changed. My mother watches this across pages and pages of journal entries over nearly a decade, checking in on it, returning to it, approaching it from different angles, the way she approached the sequence itself. She is not alarmed in the way you'd expect alarm to read. She is more like a scientist who has found a result she cannot explain and cannot stop examining. She describes having coffee with Priss 2 years after the project. Priss was fine, more than fine, warm, engaged, present, still herself in every way that mattered and different in one way. My mother could not immediately name. She came back to it in the journal. She seemed to have stopped fighting something, not given up. That's not the right phrase. More like a person who has put down a bag they've been carrying for so long they forgot it was a bag. She describes a lunch with Aldrich 8 years out. He was the same way. The ordinary friction of daily life, the small social urgencies and professional anxieties and the low-level striving that most people run on had softened in him without removing anything she could identify as essential. He was not checked out. He was not distant. He was more present, if anything, not less, but present at a different scale, like someone who had been given a longer view of things and found it harder to revert to the shorter one. She writes, "I have been watching them for almost a decade, and I cannot determine whether what happened to them is damage or arrival. I have tried to find the dividing line, and I cannot find it." She writes, several entries later, "I kept my exposure to the sequence minimal because I was afraid of what I was watching. I looked at it as little as I could while still maintaining my analysis. Whether that was wisdom or cowardice, I have never resolved." The last entry in the final journal is dated about a year before she died. I had to read it twice. "The sequence is in everyone. This has always been true and will always be true. It is not activated by reading it or studying it or any form of physical exposure. The condition that activates it is the knowledge that it is in you, the knowing. I believe this with more confidence than I have believed anything I have not been able to prove." Aldrich confirmed it when I finally asked him directly, after 30 years of not asking. "I have spent 20 years protecting myself from knowing, and I no longer know if that was the right decision. I don't know what the knowing would have cost me. I don't know what not knowing cost me either. I am very tired of not knowing." I closed the journal. I set it on my kitchen table and looked at it for a while. I am human. I have a genome. The sequence is in my genome. I knew this now. I remember very specifically the moment I understood that, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and the journal in front of me, and the particular quiet of a Wednesday evening. Not the knowledge that the sequence existed in human genomes, the knowledge that it existed in mine, in me, in whatever the genetic architecture underlying the thing I identify as myself actually is. I sat there for a long time, and then I went to bed. I waited for something to happen. That was my first response, which tells you something about how I process things, which is to say badly when the thing being processed is personal rather than professional. I looked for the moment where things shifted because I work with documents, and documents have moments where things shift, and I expected my own experience to follow the same structure. There was no such moment. What happened instead arrived the way weather arrives. Not a single event, but a gradual condition. The texture of my days changed without any individual day changing enough to point to. The things that used to catch me, the specific professional anxieties about deadlines and whether my work was good enough, the low-level social friction of navigating other people's moods, the background noise of ordinary adult concern about whether I was spending my time on the right things. These things did not disappear. They remained present and technically accounted for. But they sat at a slightly different distance from me than they used to, like a sound that is as loud as it ever was, but that you have moved slightly further from. I was not depressed. I want to be clear about this because I thought about it carefully and I know what depression feels like, and this was not it. Depression flattens everything and makes it heavier. What was happening to me was more like things staying exactly as vivid and exactly as real while becoming slightly less personal, slightly less urgent, as if the part of my brain that assigns importance to things had recalibrated its scale. I was easier to be around. I noticed this from the outside, which is a strange way to notice something. My colleagues seemed more relaxed around me. Conversations went longer. A friend I'd been out of touch with for a few months called and said she'd been thinking about me and that she hoped I was doing okay. And when I told her I was fine, she said I sounded different and asked in a good way. I would have called all of this an improvement if I hadn't known what caused it. I found Aldrich through my mother's address book, a physical one, which she kept updated in the specific way of a person who distrusted the cloud with her important information. His name was in there, with a Vermont address and a phone number and an email. I wrote him an email on a Sunday afternoon and told him I was Elaine's son and that I had read her journals and that I'd like to speak with him if he was willing. He replied the next morning. He said he would be glad to meet and gave me directions to his house. I drove up on a Saturday in November. Vermont in late fall is a specific kind of beautiful, all bare branches and low grey sky and the last of the colour going out of things, and the drive up gave me 2 hours to sit with what I was going to say. His house was small and well kept and full of books in the way of someone who reads steadily and without urgency, not collecting, but using. He made coffee in a kitchen that smelled like coffee had been made in it every morning for decades. He was tall and white-haired and had the attentiveness my mother had described, the quality of someone who listens before he speaks and means what he says when he speaks. We sat at his kitchen table and I told him about the journals. I told him what my mother had written about him and Pris and the sequence and the knowing. I told him I had read all of it and understood it and that I knew now. He listened without surprise. He nodded at the right places and didn't react dramatically to anything. About halfway through, I realized I was not telling him anything he didn't know. The only new information in the room was me. When I finished, he asked how long ago I had read the last journal. I said about 3 weeks. He nodded. He said it was early. He said the first few months were the adjustment, and that was the word he used. And he used it the way you use a word that you've decided on after trying several others. I asked him what my mother thought she was watching when she watched him change. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. He said Elaine was one of the most precise people he had known, and that her caution about the sequence was genuine, and he had always respected it, even when he didn't share it. He said she believed they were losing something, the urgency, the striving, the human sense that everything is perpetually at stake. She watched those things soften in him, and she read it as a deficit, something removed from a system that needed it. He said he had spent 30 years with that interpretation sitting next to his own experience, checking one against the other. I asked him what he concluded. He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone finding language for something they have already found the language for, but want to say carefully. He said, I lost the feeling that everything was very important. I haven't decided if that's the loss or what the loss made room for. I drove home in the dark and I didn't listen to the radio. The weeks after Aldrich folded into each other without sharp edges, the changes continued at the pace they had established, which was slow and consistent. The urgency dial kept settling. Not to zero. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters here. Not absence, adjustment. The things that used to feel like emergencies still registered as problems. The things that used to feel like problems still registered as considerations. Everything scaled down one level, and the one level made a significant difference to the quality of a given day without changing the content of it. I kept working. My translations got cleaner. I started finding the essential sentence in a paragraph faster than I used to, and this was not because I was trying harder, but because whatever was happening with my sense of proportion was clarifying what mattered in a piece of writing the same way it was clarifying what mattered in a day. My editor mentioned it. I didn't explain. A friend asked me at dinner one evening if I was seeing someone. I said no and asked why. He said, I seemed lighter. Not happy exactly, he said, because I didn't seem any happier or unhappier than usual, just lighter, like something that had been sitting on me was gone. I almost told him. I got about 3 sentences into the setup and I stopped. I stopped because I understood what completing the sentence would mean. If I told him about the sequence and about the knowing being the condition, he would know. He would know the sequence was in him because the sequence was in every human genome, because it had always been in every human genome, and there had never been a person alive who didn't carry it. I would be handing him the condition, and I didn't know yet what I would be handing him, whether it was what Aldrich had, which seemed, when I sat across from him in his book-filled kitchen on a grey November Saturday, like a livable thing, whether it was what my mother was afraid of, whether those two things were the same thing seen from different angles or genuinely different outcomes I couldn't predict. I said I'd just been getting more sleep and changed the subject. I thought about my mother on the drive home. Spending 20 years adjacent to this question and choosing the distance, choosing to not know because knowing was the mechanism. She was a scientist who found something she couldn't explain, and the thing she couldn't explain frightened her enough that she built her professional caution around avoiding the specific condition that activated it. She published her other work. She kept her notes. She watched Aldrich and Priss from a careful distance for decades and wrote about what she saw in journals she never showed anyone. And in her last entry, a year before she died, she wasn't sure she'd made the right call. There is no good position. I've turned this over enough times to be confident about that. Knowing changes you in ways you didn't choose. Not knowing means a life spent next to a question you decided not to answer. My mother chose not knowing, and at the end of her life, she sat with the possibility that not knowing had cost her something she couldn't name. She was one of the most precise people Aldrich had ever known, and she couldn't find the language for what she might have lost. I think about that a lot. The journals are in my apartment. I've read them twice through now, and I keep the final one on my desk where I can see my mother's handwriting on the cover. I haven't shared them with anyone from her professional circle. I haven't contacted the university archive or any of the organizations that would consider the material historically significant. I've thought about this decision enough to be comfortable with it, which itself might be a function of what's happening to me. The comfortableness sitting where anxiety used to sit. I've decided to allow it. I email Aldrich occasionally. He responds quickly with short, warm notes that say very little of obvious substance, and that I've come to understand as the natural correspondence of someone who has stopped needing resolution from exchanges. I am moving towards that style myself. My emails are getting shorter, more comfortable with leaving things open. I think about the sequence sometimes. What it is, what it does, what it was doing in every human genome across all of recorded history and deep into prehistory before that. My mother's journals don't answer these questions. Aldrich, when I asked him carefully, said he had his own ideas and that they had gotten less fixed over the years. He said that seemed right to him, the ideas getting less fixed. I think I understand what he means. What I can say is what I observe in myself, which is what a technical writer does when the subject is something that doesn't have a framework yet. You start with observation and you work toward language and you stay honest about how far the language actually gets you. Observation. The urgency is quieter. The striving is softer. The things that used to feel personal feel slightly less so, and the things that used to feel distant feel slightly less distant. And the net effect is that my days have a different quality than they did before September. Observation. I am, by most external measures, doing fine. Better than fine. Lighter, as my friend said, without being happier or unhappier in any way I can specifically identify. Observation. I do not know if what is happening is damage or arrival, and I have been sitting with that not knowing for several months now, and I find I can sit with it without the not knowing itself becoming a problem. This may be circular. It probably is. The thing doing the sitting is the same thing I'm trying to evaluate, and I cannot get outside it to check. My mother's word was arrived. She crossed out settled, and she wrote arrived. And arrived has always implied a destination, a place you were heading whether or not you knew you were heading there. On a Tuesday evening in late winter, I was sitting in my kitchen doing nothing in particular, not working, not reading, not on my phone. The coffee had gone cold, and the evening was doing its quiet thing outside the window, and I had been sitting there for close to an hour, and the hour had passed without friction, without the familiar internal nudge that I should be doing something more or something else. I thought about my mother, not with grief, or not only, from whatever the longer view is that I seem to be acquiring. I thought about her in her office with her journals on the shelf and the question she kept at arm's length for 20 years, turning it over in her careful way without letting herself get too close to it. I thought about her last entry, the tiredness in it, the wondering. I hope she knew she was loved. I'm fairly sure she did. I'm going to hold on to fairly sure and not reach for certain, because certain isn't something I have access to, and certain isn't what I need. Arrived implies a destination. I don't know what the destination is. I'm not sure Aldrich knows, and I'm not sure knowing is the point. What I know is that I'm here in my kitchen on a Tuesday, and the coffee is cold, and the evening is quiet, and I am a person sitting in it, and none of that requires anything from me right now. My mother spent 20 years wondering what the knowing would cost her. I think she would have liked Aldrich's kitchen. I think she would have liked sitting in it on a grey November morning with the coffee and the books and the long view of things. I think if she had let herself get that close, she would have found it livable. I think it's livable. I'm sitting with that.